Hey, I'm losing subscribers. Yay! What's up? It's the Culture Detective here investigating your favorite albums. And today I'm going to do an album review on Radiohead's The King of Limbs, released in the year 2011. So let's continue on with the Radiohead album review series. I have reviewed Pablo Honey a long time ago, and a lot of people consider Pablo Honey as their worst album. And I also agree, but that being said, Pablo Honey is still not a bad album at all. It still has a pretty decent set of alt rock songs, and then we have the Bends, which is more advanced, upgraded. And ever since Radiohead has a history of just great albums because they just can't manage to drop a bad album. They just can't make a bad album. They have OK Computer, which is this really cinematic but sad, depressing alt rock explosion. We have Kid A released in 2000, which is this really crazy, mind bending, versatile, experimental art rock pop electronic fusion album that is one of my favorite albums of all times. And then in the year 2007, they still got it. They released In Rainbows, which is a very colorful, energetic, exciting, but still very powerful and emotional and poetic and beautiful album. They just can't manage to drop a bad album. They just can't. They just can't. The band members are too talented to drop a bad album. We have vocalist Tom York, who is also a songwriter, amazing lyricist, musical genius Johnny Greenwood, who's also responsible for composing a lot of the chord progressions. We have his brother Colin Greenwood on the bass, lead guitars. We have Ed O'Brien, the incredibly charismatic guitar player, and then afterwards we have the drummer of Phil Selway. And then for the King of Limbs, it's been 4 years since In Rainbows, and they only come out with 8 tracks, which is a little underwhelming, but also 5 B-sides, which is also actually a little underwhelming, considering that in Rainbows they have released more B-sides than that, I believe. And also, before In Rainbows, we have The Eraser, a solo project by Tom York. So, for 4 years, they have come out with 13 Radiohead songs. They have released 13 Radiohead songs. And The King of Limbs is easily the shortest project in the entire band's discography. And a lot of people consider this album as their worst or their second worst. And even though I don't think it's worse than Pablo Honey, I still prefer this over Pablo Honey. I kind of get why. I mean, this album is just not as direct or as accessible as many other Radiohead projects. And this album also relies very, very heavily on polyrhythms and loops where they create a beat and just loop it over and over and over and over again. And for some people, it may get very repetitive, even though in most of the times on this album, the amazing vocals and lyricism by Tom York and the very creative, prickly instrumentals on these tracks sort of carry these tracks for me, but for some other people, it may sound kind of redundant and repetitive. And given that there are only 8 tracks on the album, a lot of people speculate that there may be a sequel, a King of Limbs Part 2 to the album, but it never actually came out. The next thing the Radiohead band had released is A Moon-Shaped Pool in 2016. And still, there are a few things that I really like about this album. First of all, Radiohead is really well known for making sad music. And every single sad song of theirs are a little bit different from one another because there's just so many shades of sadness. However, The King of Limbs is easily the band's happiest album. No doubt. Hands down. I mean, Bloom is a really beautiful track about the universe. Separator is easily the only happy ending in any Radiohead album, unless you consider Blowout a happy ending, but I wouldn't consider that. Lotus Flower is a really nice love song, or at least it sounds like it is. And many other tracks here also sound kinda happy and uplifting for some reason. Another thing special about the rollout of this album is that the band decided to release this album via newspapers. So the first round of physical release for this album is actually via newspapers, which is very creative. I mean, the previous album, In Rainbows, they released this album online for whatever price you want. The fans can pay whatever they want to buy the album. This time, yes, they have to pay a fixed amount of price, but in the form of newspapers. So that's kind of cool. Anyways, let's talk about the studio album first. We have the album opener Bloom, which is a very impressive and cinematic opening for a Radiohead album. Not necessarily the most focused, hardcore, or refreshing opening, but still very cinematic, very beautiful, very humbling. We get these reverby, echoey piano sort of looping around in a very nice way. We get these very fuzzy drums, which is at this point already a trademark sound for Radiohead, springy guitars, and lyrics about open your mouth wide, a universal sigh. And while the oceans bloom, it's what keeps me alive. So the lyrics on this album are incredibly abstract. And it's really hard to decipher what exactly the band is trying to say, but regardless of that, it feels like this track is sort of a tribute to the universe of how big and how unexplored it is. And in fact, I think Radiohead at some point collaborated with the very well-known modern musical composer Hans Zimmer to work on the opening theme for a very well-known documentary series on BBC called The Planet Earth with the track Bloom. So there's that. And other than that, there are these deserty swells of vocals and strings, which doesn't match with the chord progression at all, but they still somehow fit and make the track more lively. And overall, this track feels very green. It feels very dense, abstract, and alive, and it's an experience. Up next, we have Morning, Mr.Magpie, which is also a pretty upbeat track. In fact, the first, not really the first five, but let's say on the King of Limbs tracks 2, 3, 4, 5 are all very upbeat, exciting, not really exciting, but fast-paced tracks, just back to back to back to back. And then the last three are three slower, quieter, more indulgent tracks, just back to back to back. So the arrangement is a little bit strange. Anyways, Morning, Mr.Magpie, it's more focused of a track. We get these very quick, prickly guitars, snappy drums. The verses, the vocal melodies on the verses, they sound very strange. They don't sound catchy at all. They are very riddled, puzzled, shrouded. And we have lyrics about Mr. Magpie stealing melody. It may be about people plagiarizing the band, but it may also be something else. Nobody really knows. Even though I'm not a huge fan of the verses and the chord progression of this track, there's one thing in this track that I really, really love, and that is after the halfway point of the track, we get this really strange, off-kiltered, mystical guitar solo that just sort of grinds upwards very slowly in a challenging way, and it just sounds fantastic. Anyways, we have the track Little by Little, which in my opinion is super duper underrated. This is one of my favorite songs on the album. Little by Little is extremely underrated. We get these chilled guitars with a very challenging chord progression that sounds very sour, but also sometimes very clear and hard-working. And we also get these chugging bells and crankling sounds. And again, if you're not a fan of repetition, you may be turned off by this, but I just really love the texture of the beat on this track, and it just carries the track very, very well. And I find the verses and choruses incredibly catchy on this song. And I also really like the saddened, slow bridge that sort of builds up to the ending of the track. It's just a really, really fun track. Little by, hook by crook. The next track is Feral, and it is a 3-minute, 13-second long instrumental track. Not really instrumental, there are vocals in it, but the way the vocals are processed chopped up, makes the track instrumental, simply. And I want to say that this track is sort of like an interlude, but it also doesn't act like an interlude at all. It's a very strange and confusing track, very schizophrenic sounding as well. We get these fuzzy drums, blurts of keyboards that sounds very inhuman, very alien. It just floats on the surface and then disappears and then it appears again, and it feels very irregular. We get these very echoey processed vocals and up and down bass. And in the studio version, the bass is a little faint, but in the Live in the Basement version, the bass is very loud, which is the reason why the Live in the Basement version of Feral is so much better than the studio version, where the bass just goes bam, 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 and it adds a layer of excitement to it. But in the studio version, it just sounds like a combination of sounds and instrumentals that doesn't really make sense together. And it's not that they create a certain atmosphere or a mood like many other Radiohead tracks do, so it's just kind of confusing. Anyways, to follow up, we have Lotus Flower, which is a huge single leading up to the album. And this track is easily the most accessible track on the entire album. Absolutely catchy. The icy chilled instrumentals are great. We get these hand claps, cycling keyboards, which is really nice. And then we have the lyrics, which is also really abstract, but also really, really nice. Especially the chorus, which is just very beautiful. Slowly we unfurl as lotus flowers, 'cause all I want is a moon upon a stake. And the music video is also really, really nice, where Tom York, in black and white, Tom York just dances in a very avant-garde way. That's all. That's the music video. They just yes, while this isn't like the most creative Radiohead music video ever, I mean, just look at the stop motion of the very strange people lying on the streets in Just, or the man being followed by a car on Karma Police. This video is definitely not one of the most creative ones, but still, they just can't stop making good music videos. They just can't stop. And Tom York is a good dancer. What can I say? I mean, here's the thing. Here's the thing about dancing. I'm fine with choreographed dances, but when a person just dance however they want without any rehearsal or planning, just going along with the music, it just feels so much more livelier and so much more realistic. That's why I kind of prefer, unchoreographed dance so much more than choreographed dance, because unchoreographed dances feel so much more real and grounded. And that's exactly what's going on with Tom York. Anyways, afterwards we have Codex, which is probably my favorite track on the album. We have a very strange, brief, disenfranchised intro, which then leads into these very, very simplistic pianos, but they're so simple, yet they feel so powerful. They're so clean. They're so clear. They're so transparent. They're see-through. They're like pure water. And there's a certain sadness and loneliness to it. There's a certain cleanliness to it that just cleanses your soul. Yet the sadness still remains, and it's there. It's not an intense sadness. It's subtle, it's nuanced, and it's just poignant. It's so poetic. It hits you in the heart. The lyrics, sleight of hand, jump off the end into a clear lake, no one around. Another song about jumping into the water. Like Pyramid Song and Weird Fishes, arpeggi. And also the ending line, the water's clear and innocent. It isn't the water who killed you. And Tom York's vocals is magical on this track, absolutely gorgeous. And then we get these deserty strings, and this time it fits so well into the track, even though it doesn't line up with the chord progression or anything. It still adds a layer of disenfranchisation to the track, which makes it even dreamier and more poetic. Anyways, the next track is also very quiet and slow. We have Give Up the Ghost with its jungly sounds, birds chirping, simple hand drums, and this track in its core is a very slow, warm tune. I really love the nostalgic, sweet chord progression of the track, and also the refrain, don't hurt me no more, which sounds like a call for help, but given how serene and peaceful this track is, it doesn't sound like it. And that being said, there is a problem with this track, and that is this track is 4 minutes and 50 seconds long, and there really isn't much progression in this track other than the very layered cycling ending, which reminds me a lot of In Limbo off of Kid A. But other than that, I wish there would be more dynamic on this track. And then the album ends off with Separator, which is the only happy ending in a Radiohead album. We have Blowout, which I mean kind of is a happy ending. It sounds happy, but lyrically not really. Street Spirit Fade Out is an incredibly dark and chilling moment about death. OK Computer ended with the absolutely dreary and depressing, claustrophobic explosion of the tourist. Kid A ended sounding like we just got transported to heaven because we just died. Amnesiac ended off incredibly lonely and sour, as if we're being trapped in a glass house, literally. A Wolf at the Door is a dejected, fuck it all, I'm done with life kind of song, and Rainbows ended off with a very sad, painful goodbye. And this album ended off with Separator, which is a very lively, hopeful track. Hopeful would be the right word. Another happy song that I can think of that's made by Radiohead is Cut Tooth, which is a B-side off of Amnesiac. They have only made 2 songs that I deem happy. 2. But still, this is a great track. I love the crispy drums, the echoey soft vocals, the chord progression sounds really lively and beautiful. The twiny guitars sound very hopeful in the second half, and we have these refrains, wake me up, wake me up. And it's a pretty nice ending to the album. So that being said, there are only 8 tracks here, and of course I have to talk about the B-sides. And again, before I talk about the B-sides, I have to mention that every time they go on tour for the King of Limbs, before they go onto the stage, they would play a little musical number. And this time it is specific to this tour, so that's pretty special. Anyways, we have 5 B-sides tracks. To start off, we have These Are My Twisted Words, which is it sounds like it could end up on the King of Limbs with its very looped, snappy drums, the very disorienting icy guitars, very, very disorienting. I mean, they're very echoey, reverby, they cascade off of one another, they're very icy. My favorite part of the track is the bass line. It's very challenging. Bum, 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 bum. And also the very sinister, bitter vocal melodies, which are fantastic. And yeah, even though musically it isn't one of the most impressive tracks, it still serves pretty well as a track on its own. Up next, we have Supercollider, which is Radiohead's longest song at 7 minutes and 2 seconds long, and god damn, I love this track. Supercollider, let's go. This track is a perfect track for an album opener. Bloom is also great as an album opener, but so is Supercollider. The buzzy keyboards, the very loud tapping beats, and the very consistent keys on this track, they just sound so amazing. And the vocal melodies, they're so hopeful. It sounds like we're going into a new world, going to a new dimension, a new dawn, a new day, a new beginning. It sounds like we have finally figured out what life is about and we're about to head over to another realm. It just sounds very transcendent in a way. And it sort of puts you in a space as well. It puts you in a space where everything around you is super clear and sort of clean. Again, Radiohead songs are magical in that they put imagery inside your head. There are many songs Radiohead had made which makes you imagine things when you listen to it, even though it's not related to the lyrics or the instrumentals of the song at all. But you would see imagery when you listen to tracks like this. Same goes for Supercollider. We have lyrics like, I have jettisoned my illusions, I have dislodged my depression, and it sounds like Thom Yorke is definitely in a better place while writing this track, and there are also quieter moments on this track, which gives this track a lot of dynamic and progression, and I love it. The second half of this single is The Butcher, which has this very dry, chompy beat, some monotone pianos, icy, cold-blooded vocals, tense, gory lyrics, and it sounds exactly like a song that came off of Thom Yorke's The Eraser. And towards the end, we also get these moans, these very iconic moans and grunts from Thom Yorke, and they fit into the track really well. That being said, I wouldn't say this is one of the more impressive tracks off of Radiohead's discography, even though it's not bad. And then we have The Daily Mail, and it's a freaking great song. It's not the most original sounding Radiohead song, I have to admit. It sounds like Fog again, but more cinematic. It sounds like Sail to the Moon, but I guess not as clear and as dense as Sail to the Moon. This one is more stripped back, just a really quiet and humble piano ballad with these drowsy, lonesome piano chords. And then halfway through we get a key change where suddenly we get these guitars and huge horn hits, and it becomes very challenging and somewhat bluesy. Kind of reminds me of the track Just, and it just sounds very alive. It sounds like we're witnessing a sunrise. It sounds like after a while of pain and suffering, we have finally accepted the challenge and is ready to face the world, and it's just such a powerful feeling, and it's fantastic. And then we have Staircase, which is also an amazing track in my opinion. Quick drums and beats, and the keys are very laid back but busy at the same time, or more like the guitars are very busy but the keys are laid back, and together they are conflicting yet they sound great together. And this track is very catchy, very accessible. I really love the bitter, dreary bridge of the track as well. We get these strings that swell occasionally. These descending bass line is also really, really fantastic. And I really love the bridge of the track. My pot is full, let me take control. So yeah, overall, The King of Limbs is probably my second least favorite track, album from Radiohead. Given that in the studio album itself there are 3 tracks that could have been better. But that being said, there are actually a good handful of B-sides. If only the band replaced Morning Mr.Magpie, Feral, and Give Up the Ghost with Supercollider, These Are My Twisted Words, and Staircase, and maybe also add The Daily Mail, maybe also add The Butcher, then the album would be easily an 8 out of 10, maybe even a 9 out of 10 if arranged and produced masterfully. But unfortunately that's not the case. But that being said, I still love a good deal of this album, and I still think it's incredibly underrated. The opener and the ending of the studio album are both very great. I think Little by Little is very underrated. Codex is absolutely beautiful. Lotus Flower is a really catchy track, what can I say? And yeah, it's not bad at all. My favorite track here is Codex, and my least favorite is Feral. I'm giving Radiohead's The King of Limbs a strong 7 out of 10. So, if you're listening to this album from Radiohead from 1 to 10, how much did you rate it? Like if you like it, and subscribe if you want more. And thanks for watching. I will review Black Bear, 6ix9ine, and A Moon-Shaped Fool, and Everything's Reanimator very, very soon.